Oh, looks like we're live. Hey, everyone out there. Welcome to the GCP online meetup. This is our 31st session, and we'll today be talking about Streaming Pipelines 101 on GCP. And I am one of our intrepid hosts, Anthony Bushong, and I'm joined here by a very special guest, Yuri. So Yuri's going to be walking us through this topic today. So Yuri, you want to say hi to everyone out there?
Hi, folks. My name is Yuri Grinshteyn. I'm another customer engineer here at Google. You may remember me from other meetups, such as the Stackdriver one and the Kubernetes one last week. So it's a pleasure to be back. And Anthony, thank you, as always, for the opportunity.
Oh, no problem. We're excited to have you now. Now we have you in the hot seat, which is always a good thing because I know you'll shine. Again, for those of you who are joining for the first time, this is the GCP online meetup. We're trying to do about weekly sessions on various GCP technologies. So if you have something you'd like to see, definitely let us know on our meetup page or on our YouTube page, and subscribe, because I think we're going to start to do some of these kind of ad hoc and just go live when we are able to grab an expert's time like Yuri. So again, if you like the content, click like and subscribe, and we want to see more of you at each of these every week. But I think that's enough from my part, Yuri. Let's see what you got today.
All right, thanks again. And by the way, calling me an expert in front of all these people is just not nice.
Man, you know what? I've been on the other side of that, and I hate when people call me the expert. So I should have caught that, but I usually am pretty impressed with your work. So.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. I want to remind everyone that today's topic is called Streaming Pipelines 101. So let's go ahead and start there. Anthony, can you?
Yeah, so you can see your screen. Let me make sure that everyone else can see it. Yeah, I think we're good.
Okay, very good. So let's go ahead and get rolling. So again, the intent of today's topic is to kind of walk you through a very basic example of how to set up a streaming pipeline on GCP, right? So the idea behind streaming, and it's sort of a different paradigm to event or data processing in batches, right? Streaming is the idea that as events take place, you process them as they occur, right? Rather than batch, where you wait for a number of events to take place, then they possibly get aggregated in something like a batch file, and then you process them in batches. You may also be familiar with the concept of micro batches, which is something that people refer to, which is the idea that you're trying to, you're basically using the batch processing paradigm, but you're trying to run it as frequently as possible, almost to kind of create a stream process, right? That's not what we're going to be talking about today, right? Today, we're really going to be talking about using Google Cloud Dataflow to do a true streaming pipeline where events are processed really as they occur, right? And the general steps we're going to look at is, okay, how do you ingest the events? What are the transformations that you need to run on them? How do you store them? And obviously then there's the visualization and consumption layers, which I'm actually not going to get into today. So today we're really going to focus on the process and transformation, and then storage, and a little bit of query, right? For those of you that are interested, you can actually check out everything I'm going to show you on GitHub. I've made this available as a repository. You will probably be amazed by how simple this all is, but I'm going to show you literally everything it took in the demo today, right? So again, the idea behind stream processing is that we're going to be taking data and running it through a basically an ETL pipeline, or sort of the streaming equivalent of an ETL pipeline in real time, right? So we're processing all the data as it happens, unlike baking a batch of cookies where you run a bunch of steps on a bunch of stuff, then you have to wait, and then at the end you get the result. Streaming is the idea that I'm going to be exposing everything kind of downstream to our repository, to our consumers, as things happen, right? So streaming pipeline is kind of what we're going to be talking about. So here is a kind of a reference architecture for what are the options for deploying a streaming pipeline. What I'm going to be covering today is not the entirety of this, all right? So let me kind of focus specifically on what I'm going to show you today. Today I'm going to be focusing on 4 things. First, I'm going to show you how to, like an example of how to generate events. What I'm going to have is basically an application running on App Engine where every time I hit the page, I submit some data, it gets posted to a Cloud PubSub topic, right? And that's our transport layer in this pipeline. When transport is basically the idea that you're taking things from one place to another. PubSub is the solution that we recommend using to basically transport data around the globe, right? You can get it onto the Google network as soon as possible. Then you're using our backplane to send you data rather than sending it out over the internet. PubSub is a managed global service, so you can post to it from anywhere in the world using the same endpoint. You don't have to worry about setting up a kind of a regional presence or anything like that. Then PubSub is going to send it to our Dataflow pipeline. Dataflow is basically our managed Apache Beam service, right, using the Dataflow runner. Apache Beam is a project that some of you may be familiar with, but it's essentially the idea that you can use the same exact programming paradigm to do batch and stream processing. Today, I'm going to be specifically focusing on showing you how to use it for stream processing, but you can actually use almost the same exact code to run batch processing. All you'd have to really do is just change the intake. So today, I'm going to be showing you how to do an intake from PubSub, but you can do an intake from something like cloud storage or something else like that, where kind of data is at rest rather than streaming data. So I'm going to show you a very basic example of a data flow transform. Then we're going to write it to BigQuery, and then from there, obviously, you can query it using an application running on App Engine, on Container Engine. You can use it query using BigQuery directly, which is I'm going to show you today. Or obviously, you can use other visualization mechanisms like Data Studio or something like that. So that's what we're going to see today. So that's what the demo is going to cover. It's going to cover very basic Node.js app, running an App Engine to produce events using PubSub for transport. I'm going to be using Dataflow to do the processing and loading into BigQuery. I've actually updated my pipeline, and I did not update my slides, so I apologize for that. I'm actually using the latest SDK. I've updated it to 2.1, where all of the APIs I'm going to be using are all Apache Beam APIs rather than the cloud data flow equivalent. And then I'm going to be storing it all in BigQuery and just kind of doing very basic querying from there. So Anthony, before I get into the demo, any questions?
Yeah, I think that one of the questions that I have, getting a little bit ahead. So a question that I have is really kind of in twofold. One is how are people doing this before Apache Beam, right? My understanding is that previous to Apache Beam going open source, MapReduce has been around, and the Hadoop ecosystem has been around a much longer time. So I guess what is Apache Beam bringing to the table that's new and transformative as far as making it worth people's while for kind of exploring it in a streaming fashion?
Yeah, good question. So I'll caveat my answer by saying that I'm not an expert on the Hadoop ecosystem. I've worked with some folks that have done some stuff there, but I myself do not have a background in Hadoop. I'm aware that you can do both batch and stream processing in Spark. So I believe that you could do stream processing with Spark Streaming or Apache Storm.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also my understanding that the way you write code to do stream and batch processing in Spark is, whereas what Apache Beam and then Dataflow, which is our managed offering, provide are basically a way to almost use the same exact code to do batch processing without really having to consider them to be two separate paradigms. The real problem it solves is not just that of sort of ease of use and ease of writing code, but it also avoids the problem that you may be familiar with that people sometimes refer to as Lambda architecture, where you have one thing that's doing stream processing, and then for like late arriving events, you'll run like a batch to basically catch up. So it's a very common problem that you have to address when you're doing like large scale event processing, where your data is not always coming in when you expect it. So for example, if you're talking about like digital advertising, clicks and impressions and views all the time, but there may be data that's, for example, for web sessions that are long running, people leave their browsers up for a long time, and you still want to get those impressions but you need that, that data is going to come much later than when it actually happens. So you're still running a batch process essentially alongside your stream process to try and catch up, to get those late arriving events to still show up accurately. And if you're using something like Spark, then you're having to kind of maintain two very different code bases for batch processing and stream processing, whereas Beam really allows you to unify that and kind of eliminate the Lambda architecture entirely. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I think one of the major takeaways that I heard you say earlier that gets me excited is the very little code changes between batch and streaming. So let's say I'm currently dumping a handful of events, and I have a pipeline that's picking them up out of an object store like cloud storage every 5 minutes and writing some transforms. If I want to start, kind of processing those in real time, maybe I don't want to be running batch pipelines every 5 minutes. It sounds like it's not too difficult to begin to maybe just start publishing to PubSub and then perform the same type of transforms on those events. And so without having to kind of drastically refactor the way I was doing these transforms, right? So that's pretty cool. I think that it gives kind of a nice bridge for people who are new to stream processing. Because I think even in other places, it's still a relatively new paradigm. And again, batch processing has been around for, more than a decade at this point. So
probably. I remember working with, shipping FTP files around and trying to get them processed, 15
Awesome. Well, we're excited to see this in the demo. So let's see what you got.
All right, cool. Thanks. All right. Well, so let me share my screen again, and then I will actually switch to kind of the meat of this. So I'm going to start right. You know what? Let me actually show you how it works, just so you have a sense of what it is that I've actually built here. So here is a very basic application running on App Engine, right? And what it's going to do is whenever I put in a message, I'm going to say, hello, everyone on the Meetup. And I'm going to say, send message, right? And it says, OK, I've received the data. And now I'm going to go into BigQuery. And I've got basically a very simple data structure here. I literally have just one data set. Let me make this bigger so everyone can see. I literally have a single data set. That data set has a single table in it. And so when I select, basically everything from that table, there's the message that I just put in, right? So on the surface, this looks very easy, right? You're taking web input and you're writing it to a database. This is as basic can be. But you can imagine that this is something that's intended to be done at scale. So what I want to show you is what are the mechanics that I had to build in order to actually get this to work. And where I started is in the event producer, which is this App Engine app, right? Whoops, sorry, looks like my light in this room just went off. So let me switch to the code here, and I'm going to show you a couple of things. I'm going to close my terminal here. This is a very basic bit of code. This is an Express Node app. So for those of you that may be familiar with Express, you see I've just got a couple of routes here. Basically, if you make a GET request to the page, I'm going to display the form. And if when I do a post from that form, I'm going to handle the post. The post is pretty basic in that it basically takes the request, it parses out the fields. You know what? I'm actually, and I apologize, I think I'm looking at the wrong, because I use a very similar template, I'm actually looking at the wrong code. So let me switch to that. Hopefully you can still see it. Here's my basic pipeline JS. Again, so on the get, I'm just doing the display form. On the post, I am basically processing the fields of the form. And what I'm doing is I am parsing the form. I'm pulling out the message from that form. Okay, and then I'm calling the publish message function. The publish message function is pretty basic in that I identify a PubSub topic, and then I create a buffer and I push that message to PubSub. All right, so that's the first layer. Mm-hmm. Build the web form, take the input that the user puts in, put it to a PubSub topic.
Yuri, do you mind zooming in? I think there's a lot of good stuff, and but we just want to make sure the audience can see what you're highlighting there.
Okay. Is that better?
Perfect.
Okay. So again, there's really four major things here. There's, well, let's say three. There's the two routes that I define in my Node app, one for a get, which just displays the form, and one for post that processes the form. There is the process form function, which basically just parses my input and pulls out the message that I need to send, and then does a publish message. And the publish message function itself, which just sends it to a predefined PubSub topic. Clear enough?
Yeah, definitely. So let's see what, like, kind of the second layer of what's picking up from PubSub.
Right. So yeah, and then PubSub is pretty straightforward. And then what I need is to actually have my actual streaming pipeline, and that is now written in Java. And the reason that it's written in Java, and you really have two options here. You have Java or Python. At this point, streaming can only be done in Java. Batch can be done in both Java and Python. So I've got a whole bunch of imports here, and it basically just, I've got just my class. And what I'm doing is I'm defining some setup stuff. So I'm setting up, basically where I'm going to be pulling the data from. So my PubSub data source and my BigQuery table. Okay. And I've got a couple of interesting things here. What I'm basically doing is I'm defining this as a streaming pipeline, and then I'm defining this thing called a pipeline, this object called a pipeline, which is something that Apache Beam allows you to create. And then once I have my pipeline defined, then there are really just three steps to what I'm trying to do. Step one is I read from PubSub, and I read the string message from the topic that I've defined up ahead. Right? And you can see the way the syntax flows is pretty easy to understand. Then the second step is I apply another transform to my pipeline, where I'm basically doing a string to row converter, and in GitHub you'll see what that function looks like. But I'm basically taking the string message that PubSub gives me and converting it to a table row. And then step three of my pipeline is I'm writing it to BigQuery, where I've specified the table name. I'm telling it that if the table doesn't exist, please create, do an append. And if there's any fails, make sure you retry, and here's the schema, which again in our example is very simple. And then I just say, okay, run the pipeline. That's all I have to do. I've broken this up into multiple lines for readability, but this is basically 3 lines of code, right? Now I need to I needed to write the function to do my string to row converter. And I needed to define my table schema and some of the other setup stuff around my pipeline. But the pipeline itself is literally 1 line of code per transformation step.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. And then what you do once you've written your Java code, and I've got this saved as some examples, is you basically, in my case, I used Maven. So you can either compile it locally, which is what this does, just to make sure that you don't have any compilation errors or anything like that. Let me make this a little bigger as well. Or you can actually publish it to Dataflow, right? And again, you're using the same command. You're saying compile, you specify your project, you specify that you want to use the Dataflow runner. And then once you publish it to Dataflow, then I'm going to switch back to my now I'm going to go to my console. Here's my Google Cloud Console. I'm going to go to Dataflow. Open this current running streaming pipeline. All right. And you can see, based on the 3 lines of code or the 3 transform steps in my code, it creates 3 steps in my pipeline. It's a pretty cool visualization. Right? It's telling me that it's auto-scale this to 1 worker. That's one of the other cool things about Dataflow that very easily with things like Spark is auto-scaling. So basically, based on the volume of data that comes in, it'll actually auto-scale my pipeline. It'll stand up, however many worker nodes need to be running to process the data. For each step of the pipeline, I can see things like, do I have lag between the time the data comes in and the time it leaves? I can see how many elements have entered, that particular step, and how much data that particular step has processed. All right. So now I've got 4 elements added, and again, I can go back to my application here. I can send hello again, and I can say send message. And now if I look back at my pipeline in a second or so, this should, I'll just click off that step, and I'll click back on the step, and now it says, okay, there have been 5 elements added because the element that I just sent now gets added. And that can follow those elements, basically down the pipeline. And here's my, my step where I'm writing to BigQuery. So again, this is intended to be basically a 101 level introduction to how you might stand this up. As I said before, I've published all of the code here on GitHub. There's there's not a whole lot to it, right? I basically have my HTML file that displays the form. I've got my JavaScript, which is my Node.js app that does the post, and then I have a single line or single file of Java code that actually sets up the pipeline. And based on that, you're getting everything that you just saw.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I think one of the things that we didn't see, I think is worth calling out is typically in kind of the paradigm of large-scale data processing, typically you're having to configure some type of resource manager that is aware of all of the nodes that are working on kind of processing these events. I didn't see you configure anything like that. Is that something you get with Dataflow, or?
Yeah, great question, and that's exactly what Dataflow allows. It's essentially what Dataflow provides, right? So when I submit my job, I do have the option of specifying some more parameters, things like, what region do I want my pipeline to run? Do I want to use auto scaling, or do I want to specify the number of workers? What compute shapes do I want to use for my workers if I want to manage that rather than just having Dataflow determine that automatically? So there is more control that's available if I want it. But if I don't really care about any of that, if I don't have any particular reason to manage the infrastructure, there's no reason for me to do it. All I do, again, is just say, is deploy it with Maven, specify the project that I want to run it in, and off it goes. So while all of that is available, and there may be valid reasons to use it, especially once you're doing more advanced things that are not at the quote-unquote 101 level that we're talking about today, just deploying the pipeline and letting Dataflow take care of the rest is really easy.
That's awesome. I really appreciate you walking through this, Yuri. I think that, for those watching out there, we do, so Apache Beam is open source, as you can probably guess. But I think, this is my experience, that Dataflow is the best runner to use Apache Beam with, as far as kind of quickly getting started and bootstrapping, and really not having to configure a lot of the underlying administration that again is usually it's the connotation that comes with advanced pipeline processing. So again, we encourage you to go to Yuri's GitHub repo and give it a go for yourself. Yuri, is there anything else you wanted to cover? Otherwise, we can jump into some of the questions that we have.
No, man, that's all I got. Let's see what else people want to talk about.
Okay, so I think that we have a question from John Liu, and he's asking about writing into BigQuery. Where did it write to exactly? I think you showed kind of if we can just highlight over that code again.
Yeah, so there's 2 things to show here. In my code, the write to BigQuery is the last transform that I'm applying to. And what I'm specifying is the table name, right? In this case, it's just a string that it takes. I just have to specify some additional options. And I think it forces you to specify like the create this position and the write this position, which is basically, what do I do if that table doesn't exist? And then do I append or overwrite the data? I also inserted this other option for failed insert retries. And then finally, you just specify a schema, which is I've defined. I'll scroll up there just so you can kind of see what it looks like. The schema is defined here. It's basically a JSON schema that then gets converted to a schema object. And then really the only purpose there is that to basically provide that this is message is the field and string is the type, and it can in fact be nullable. So you just have to provide some of that. And so in my example, I pre-created, now let's switch to BigQuery. In BigQuery, I pre-created this data set called dataset. I pre-created this table called test table. We can look at the details. You can see actually the schema here. I'm going to close this one little query. This is a very basic table. It's literally one field. It's a string, right? You can obviously make this a lot more complex. There's a lot more that can go into it. But in my, just to stand up this one-on-one level example, it was literally just take a single string from PubSub, write it to BigQuery. So it's not right. I'm not doing any aggregation in my pipeline. I'm not doing any windowing or any of those other kind of advanced things. So at some point, it might be worth maybe on this meetup, let's do a 200 level session to talk about some of the more advanced Beam topics like windowing and error handling and some of those other things. But for my purposes, for what I wanted to show today, I wanted this to be literally like the hello world equivalent of streaming pipelines. And so to do that, all I had to do was basically create a very basic BigQuery table with a single field. And then in my pipeline, just specify, hey, write to it using the message that you got from the previous step.
Fantastic. And I think there was a question earlier too from Alex just about stream processing in general. So this kind of guarantees that as far as the real-time aspect, that events will be processed in real time. Doesn't necessarily mean that the aggregations are being written or emitted in real time. Is that right? So that's something where you can kind of, that's probably for a 201 session as far as how you can control.
Yeah, so I also want to be careful about when we talk about real time, right? Because even as you saw, right, there is a bit of a delay between the time that I hit my web page and the time that the event shows up in BigQuery. Because the transform still, I mean, it takes some amount of time to run the code on all of those on the events and process them and write them down. So it's not, the thing about streaming is that the paradigm is not necessarily about real time, although I mean that's more what you're aiming for. There will usually be some, a bit of delay. It's more that you are processing events as they happen without any aggregation, at least initially, at least sort of at the initial level of difficulty. Like as an event happens, you're running it through the pipeline. In my example, you're writing it right to your repository. Now, from here, you could do basically another pipeline. Or from here, you might do something like a Hadoop job, right? So you can run something like Hadoop processing using BigQuery as a data source if you need to do some complex, map reduce or something like that on the data after you get it. And that's when, when we looked at this reference architecture, let me switch back to it. Hopefully you can still see this, right? When we looked at this reference architecture, we talked about that Dataflow can consume any number of sources for its processing. And then down here, it can use any number of things as its target. So in our example, BigQuery as an analytics destination, but you could write, for example, you can write these events to, for example, Cloud Bigtable, which is really good for high volume, lots and lots of fast writes. And then from there, you can actually pick it up with another Dataflow pipeline and do more processing on it, and then write it to BigQuery, for example. And that's a very common design paradigm.
No, it makes perfect sense.
Is that, you're not necessarily doing this in quote unquote in real time. It's that you're really focusing on, I'm going to run every event through my pipeline as they happen, rather than doing some kind of aggregation at the start and then doing batch processing on those aggregations. Does that make sense? I know maybe I deviated from the actual question a little bit. I hope that answered it.
No, definitely. I think I think that perfectly answers what Alex was bringing up. And I think we're having some healthy discussion in the chat. So again, I think that covers it for today. Really appreciate you walking us through this, Yuri. And again, encourage everyone watching to go check out the GitHub repo and subscribe and keep your eyes peeled for more GCP online meetup sessions. We have a lot in the pipeline, and we're excited for what we have in store. So thanks again, Yuri.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Really appreciate your time today. I hope this was useful. It was a very fun project for me to kind of get this working and figure this out. Like I said before, I did not come into this with, certainly any knowledge of Hadoop or really very much knowledge of Beam for that matter. So it was, I think, just goes to show you just how easy Beam makes it to run streaming pipelines. If someone like me can do it, then all of y'all can do it as well.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for watching, and have a nice day.
All right, folks. Thank you so much. Take care.